This week's Torah portions, double portion, are Matot and Masei. And there are a couple of really critical problems or issues that come up that I wanted to share. The first one is in the book of Numbers, chapter 31, verse 17. And it seems to me that in the entire Torah, this is probably the most terrible verse in the entire Torah. Numbers 31, verse 17. What's going on? God commanded Moses to take vengeance on the Midianites who had seduced Israel into worshiping their god Baal Peor. 12,000 Israelites went into battle and utterly destroyed the Midianite army. Midianite women and children were taken captive, and their herds were gathered as spoils of war. But Moses was furious that they were left alive. So Moses orders the following. So now, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man by lying with a male. Kill as well. So the question is, what are we to make of the Holy Bible telling us that captured women and children were to be massacred? What we think about Torah and religion and God are all riding on how we understand this one verse. We need to go back and ask the author what he had in mind. So I want to present a couple of different explanations for this terrible verse. Moses telling the Israelites, go out and slaughter little babies. Okay, so here's God's response. I never told anyone to slaughter the innocent. I instructed Moses to seek vengeance for the terrible things that the Midianites had done to Israel. War, sadly, is sometimes necessary. Massacres, on the other hand, are never justified. It was Moses who ordered that the babies be killed. Clearly, he went beyond what I said, way beyond what was morally acceptable. You need to go and ask him. So here God is saying, it wasn't me. You have to go ask Moses. Okay, so let's ask Moses. Here's what I'm imagining Moses saying. God didn't mention that at the same time he told me to go to war against Midian. He also added, afterward, you will be gathered to your kinspeople. So right after God says, have vengeance, then go up on the mountain and you will die. How would you respond to the news that you were about to die? Maybe I took out my anger at God on the Midianites, or maybe my fury was really meant for the Israelites. Once again, they disappointed me. First, it was with the golden calf. Now it's with Baal Peor, this god that they worship. And don't forget that my own wife was a Midianite. This very same people who I had married into came and tried to destroy everything I had worked for in my life. Is it such a surprise that I would have responded the way I did? Yes, my reaction was extreme. But I'm not God. I'm a human being. I made a terrible error in judgment. I'm not proud of it, but I recorded it in the Torah so that every generation after me would read about it and would learn from my mistakes. Very interesting. God says, it wasn't me, it was Moses. Moses says, yes, it was me, and I lost it, and I was angry, and it was a mistake. It was terrible. But I admit it. I wrote it into the Torah. But there's another possibility. You need to be aware that There's a modern theory, modern going back 150 years, called the documentary hypothesis. And it says it wasn't Moses in the 1300, 1200 BCE who wrote the Torah. There were four different documents known as J, E, P, and D. J standing for the word Yahweh, Yud-He, Vav-He, and E standing for Elohim. Sometimes the Torah uses Yud-He, Vav-He as the name of God. Sometimes it uses Elohim as the name of God. And scholars think that was because there were two different authors who each had a different notion at different times of how we address our God. There's a third document called P, the priestly document, made up mainly of the story of the laws of what the Kohanim and the Leviim were supposed to do. And finally, there was D, the Deuteronomic document, which is basically the fifth book of the Torah, Deuteronomy. There were these four different stories or documents that were circulating. At a later point, somebody who is called R for redactor, in other words, the editor. He took J and E and P and D, these four different accounts of the same thing, and he wove them together in such a way that we don't even realize that there possibly were four different books here, four different stories here. So R, this is what R has to say. I was the redactor of the many documents, stories, and laws that came to be assembled in exile by a people who were defeated by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, a people who saw their temple destroyed and who watched their enemies bash the heads of their babies against rocks. We know that because the psalmist wrote that in the very famous By the Rivers of Babylon. There we sat down, there we wept. Let my right hand lose its cunning. All of that also speaks about the enemy taking babies and killing them by smashing their heads against rocks. The story of the Israelites slaughtering the babies of the Midianites was a revenge fantasy. I simply substituted Midianites for Babylonians. It was much safer that way. To wish for the utter destruction of our captors would have gotten me and countless others killed. In other words, the author of the story about killing the Midianite babies, he was really, first of all, it never happened. Second of all, it wasn't about the Midianites. It was projecting onto the Babylonians, right? But you couldn't say that in a document, because if the Babylonians found it and read this, they would have killed the people who wrote it and who read it. So the readers in my day certainly knew what I was talking about. As far as I know, there is no evidence that the story in Numbers chapter 31 ever really happened. And now we hear from P, the priestly document, and he says, no, I am the author of the priestly document written some 500 years after the time of Moses. So maybe it's, the year 700 BCE. What it described in Numbers 31 never happened. It wasn't a real event. I wrote it after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. Survivors from the north headed south, among them members of the tribe of Levi. Many of them headed to Jerusalem, looking to find work in the temple. For we Kohanim, who were directly descended from Aaron, these Levites, who could trace their lineage back to Moses, were illegitimate because they had performed the service of Adonai outside of the central sanctuary in Jerusalem. Descended from Moses and his Midianite wife, they had foreign blood in them. The story was my attempt to point out that the Midianites were at one time not only our enemies, and their descendants were unworthy of serving the one God. Telling the story of the apostasy of Baal Peor, and having none other than Moses himself condemn the Midianites would have undercut any legitimacy that the Levites might have had. I'm sorry that later generations misunderstood my tale and what my motives were. I regret that because of what I wrote. Later readers of the Torah thought that Moses or that God would have ordered such a horrible thing. So in other words, according to P, this was a contest between the Kohanim, the priests, and the Levites. The Levites from the north came south. They wanted to work in the temple. The priests, the Kohanim, they saw this competition. They wanted to show that those people, the Levites who were descended from Moses, they were illegitimate. Why were they illegitimate? Because Moses married a Midianite woman. And therefore, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, descendants had foreign blood. In the meantime, the Kohanim were all descended from Aaron who married an Israelite woman. So they had pure blood. So this story was an attempt to show that the Midianites were no good and that the Levites had Midianite blood in them. It was all about work. Who was going to get the job in the temple? And P is saying, I wrote this story and never thought people would take it seriously as an event that actually happened. So with all these different possibilities, we come back to the verse, kill the Midianite babies. And it's very likely and very possible that it never really happened. It was a fictional story written for this reason or that reason, but not a true account. We're not any closer to knowing what really happened in Numbers chapter 31, verse 17. But we have learned that what a text says is not always what a text means. Okay, next story, we go to the book of Numbers, chapter 32. And here's the issue that will come up. The Israelites have spent 40 years in the wilderness. They're now coming around. They went south. Instead of going straight east from Egypt through the Sinai into Israel, they went east and then south and then around and then into what today would be Jordan, all the way on the other side of the Jordan River. And then they came west to cross over into Israel. But before they did, two tribes, Reuben and Gad, said, you know what? We're in what will one day be Syria or Jordan, and we happen to like it here. Why can't we stay? Why do we have to go into the land of Canaan, what will be Israel? Why can't we stay here? So the question is, how did that story get to be? What was motivating these two tribes after 40 years of wanting to get to the land of Israel, and now they're on the verge of entering, and they say, nah, we're going to give up that dream. We want to stay here. What was that all about? So here's an attempt to understand. Imagine the Reubenites, tribe of Reuben, said, it's beautiful here in Yahzer. That's, again, northeast of what would be Israel, somewhere in Syria, probably, near the Golan Heights. The Gadites said, Gilead is gorgeous too. Reubenites said, perfect cattle country. Gadites. If it was up to us, we'd stay right here instead of crossing the Jordan. Reubenites. What will we find there that we don't have here? Gadites. Well, technically, that's where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived. Reubenites. Actually, Abraham crossed through here on his way from Ur, and Jacob stopped on his way to Laban. Gadites. One could make the case that our settling here on this side of the Jordan is a way to protect the flank of the other tribes from the Arameans or other enemies coming from the north or the east. So it's not just a matter of, we like it here. We're here for an important purpose. We're going to be your protective flank, Israel. If enemies try to come from the north and the northeast, which they later did, the Assyrians did, the Babylonians did. So here, Gadites, Reubenites are saying, we're sort of the outpost to protect the rest of Israel. We're being noble and heroic. Reubenites. And the land of Canaan is rather small. In a few generations, it'll be overcrowded, and the other tribes will be looking to the other side of the Jordan for more space. Gadites. To tell the truth, we can't get out of our minds the report of the spies 40 years ago. Canaan is filled with giants who can step on us like grasshoppers. Over here, the worst we came up against was Sihon and the Amorites and Og and the Bashanites, and we beat them soundly. Reubenites. I am a little worried what the other tribes would think of us if we didn't go with them into Canaan. We'd be cowards and carpetbaggers and Confederates. They'd probably say we seceded from the Israelite Union. And again, 12 tribes were supposed to live in Canaan, but 2 of them are now saying, we're separating from you. We're seceding. Gadites. The tribes have always been more important than the union. Who cares what the Asherites or the Issacharites or the Naphtaliites think of us? Because 400 years ago we had a common ancestor? That's ancient history. Reubenites. What do you think Moses will say? Doesn't take much for him to lose his temper. He had one guy killed for carrying wood on Shabbat and another for blaspheming God's name. And don't forget what he did when the people worshiped the golden calf or lay with the Midianite women. Thousands were slaughtered. Gadites. He might say we're going against God's plan. Reubenites. No way to answer that objection. Gadites. Or he might take it personally and feel we're being ungrateful to him for all he did for us. Reubenites. Moses is a pretty humble guy. I don't think he'd make it about himself. Gadites. But he could accuse us of abandoning the other tribes at their hour of crisis. Reubenites. So if it comes down to that, here's what we could say. We'll go to Canaan with the other tribes and fight with them. When the land is conquered and everyone is settled, then, and only then, we'll come back here. Gadites. That's a pretty reasonable offer. All of a sudden, another tribe shows up, tribe of Manasseh. Hey, what are you guys talking about? Reubenites. Some of us were wondering about staying here instead of going into Canaan. The Menashites say, no kidding. Me and some of my people were thinking the exact same thing. Gadites. Are you willing to come with us and talk to Moses about this? Menashites. Sure. Reubenites. You know, going to him with 3 tribes puts us in a stronger position than with just 2. After all, this is 1/4 of the Israelites. And the Gadites say, let's do it. So we always speak about Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, the tribe of Reuven, the tribe of Gad, and half the tribe of Menashe. Half of them stayed on the other side of the Jordan in what would be the country of Jordan or Syria. and half of them went across into areas of the Galilee, northern part of Israel. So we have now another interesting issue, and that is in the book of Numbers, chapter 35. And here we're dealing with the issue of cities of refuge. So what you need to know is that police and judges and courts, all of that is much later. That in Torah times, you didn't have a police force and you didn't have a court system. What you had was blood vengeance, meaning that if somebody killed a member of your family, it was a member of the victim's family who were obligated to go out and to kill either the murderer or somebody else in his family. Okay? It was left up to the individuals to get their own kind of justice. Well, as we would say, you can't run a civilization, you can't run a society on that kind of every man for himself justice. It's going to lead to anarchy and chaos. So ultimately, we find that step by step, and it was a long process, step by step, they create the notion of a system of justice. And you'll see that the cities of refuge were created because of a problem in the blood avenger notion. So let's see what happens. Reuven, let's talk about Reuven and Shimon. In Hebrew, and certainly in rabbinic Hebrew, when you want to refer to two people randomly, and you want to give a hypothetical case, they generally use the names Reuven and Shimon, Reuben and Simon. These were the first two of the sons of Jacob, right? So if we've got a conflict, we always say Reuven and Shimon, okay? So Reuven says, Moses, Shimon killed my brother. Moses says, the law is clear. You, as the blood avenger, are to put Shimon to death. Shimon then comes before Moses. But wait, it was an accident. I swear it. I was chopping wood and the axe flew off the wooden handle and killed Reuven's brother. Moses says, well, if it was an accident. Reuven says, how do we know it was an accident? Maybe he's just saying that to save himself. Moses says, okay, we need witnesses. Reuven says, just one witness? How can we trust one person? Moses says, okay, two witnesses. Reuven says, how do we know that they are not in cahoots? Are we to just take their word for it? Moses says, okay, representatives of the people will determine whether the witnesses are telling the truth and whether or not it was an accident and whether or not there was any history between the victim and the perpetrator. So Shimon says, and suppose Reuven doesn't want to take their word for it and is hell-bent on revenge. How am I going to be protected? Moses says, okay, so how about we set up a city of refuge? Anyone who commits accidental manslaughter can go there and will be considered safe. No blood avenger may enter the city of refuge and kill a person who fled there, or he will be guilty of murder. Shimon says, one city of refuge? Suppose I'm far away from it and Reuven is faster than me and catches me before I get there. Moses says, okay, let's set up several cities. How about 3 on each side of the Jordan? Reuven says, but suppose a premeditated murderer runs to the city of refuge and claims sanctuary. Then justice will not be done. Moses says, okay, if it has been determined that the murderer is taking advantage of the city of refuge, then we will permit the blood avenger to enter the city and kill the person who murdered his relative. Shimon says, but wait, it was all a terrible accident. Nevertheless, I'm condemned to leave my home and family and stay in the city of refuge forever? That doesn't seem fair. So Moses says, so let's put a time limit on how long the accidental murderer has to stay in the city of refuge. What if we peg the sentence to the lifespan of the high priest? Once the high priest dies, then the sentence is up and the accidental killer can return home, and the blood avenger cannot harm him. Reuven says, but if the high priest was Aaron, who died a month ago, the stay in the city of refuge would have been for just a few weeks. If the Kohen Gadol is Eleazar, his son, right now, a few weeks after his father's death, then the sentence could be for 30 or 40 years. Where's the justice in that? And Shimon says, and what if I offer to pay Reuven a ransom? He takes the payment instead of taking my life. Would that be all right? And Reuven says, so a rich man can pay his way out of a murder and a poor man can't? That doesn't seem fair. Moses says, no, it doesn't. Look, this is very complicated. It's not a perfect system. For now, it's the best we can do. It's better than letting every individual be judge, jury, and executioner. I promise that we'll revisit this again sometime soon. So here, the point of the story is to have us see how law develops. Probably not somebody sitting down, high-minded, thinking theoretically about law and justice, but actually it begins in case law. Somebody is killed. Somebody is supposed to avenge the murder. But in this particular case, it turns out it was an accident. So what do we do about it, right? And slowly, step by step, we raise all the problems, all the objections. Moses tries to deal with them as best as he can. And he comes up with this system of the city of refuge. So we know that in the days of Moses, 1250 BCE, for all we know, there is no system of courts, law, and order. Instead, it's all up to each family to seek their own justice. Then we know by the time of the rabbis, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and the Mishnah, we know already that there are judges, that there are courts of 3, there are courts of 21, there are courts of 70 for different kinds of cases. Okay, so we know that somewhere in the 1500-year period, somehow a system of justice was set up. But it didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't decreed by God at Mount Sinai. And it probably happened, not theoretically, but came out of case law. And each generation sought to do the best that they could with whatever the circumstances were. So we come now to the Haftorah, and we have 2 Torah portions this week, Matot and Masei. And again, remember, there are 54 weekly portions. We need to read them in the course of a year, and depending whether the year is a leap year and has an extra month and 4 extra weeks added. So either we stretch out the reading of the Torah, or we combine some of the Torah portions so that we could get it all done in the 12-month period that we have. So Matot and Masei. And whenever we have a double portion, the Haftorah is always from the second Torah portion, so it would be from Masei. But if you remember from last week, we're also in a period of time now between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th day of Av, 3 Shabbases in there. And the whole notion is that these are 3 weeks of warning of punishment by Jeremiah and then later Isaiah, who are basically bringing a message of warning from God to the Jewish people. God is not happy. Unless you change your ways, you will be punished. And of course, people didn't change their ways. The punishment came through the vehicle of the Babylonians who come down, Babylonia in what is today Iraq, and who conquer the Judeans, destroy the temple, slaughter hundreds of thousands, take the survivors out to exile in Babylonia. So what's fascinating about this particular Torah, Haftorah portion, again from the book of Jeremiah, in this case mainly chapter 2, is that we see, as is done a number of times, the prophet describes the relationship between God and Israel, not as God and people, but as husband and wife. It was a relationship of love, an intimate relationship of love. And yet, what happened? The woman, Israel, was unfaithful to her husband. How are the Israelites unfaithful to God? By worshiping idols and other gods. So the prophet understood this as a marriage gone wrong. So in this piece, what I've tried to do is to see couples therapy going on, right? Can this marriage be saved? So the couple, the door opens, the therapist welcomes the husband and wife in, and he introduces himself. Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremiah, and I specialize in couples therapy. Tell me, why are you here? And so Israel, remember the wife, says, I really don't know. And God, the husband, raises his voice, you don't know? You damn well do know why we're here. Jeremiah tries to calm things. Perhaps you could bring me up to speed on what brings you here? God, the husband, says, fine, it's 2 things. She abandoned me and she's fooling around with other guys. Israel, the wife, says, well, it didn't take you long to cut to the chase, did it? Dr. Jeremiah, is he wrong in what he's accusing you of? God says, she knows I'm telling the truth. What did I ever do to you to deserve this kind of treatment? I took you out of Egypt. I brought you through the wilderness. I gave you this wonderful land. But none of that was good enough for you. All I asked is that you be faithful to me. Israel, all you ever asked? How about scrupulously obeying your 600 demands? The husband corrects her. 613. The wife says, and if I even look at another god, you get all bent out of shape. The husband says, you did more than just look. Israel, the wife, says, here we go. God says, you acted like a whore. You are no different than a lustful camel or a wild ass in the desert, sniffing after this Baal or that Baal. Those are the exact words that Jeremiah uses to the people of Israel. You embarrassed me, God says to Israel. Worse, you embarrassed yourself. And you know what really gets me? When she's in trouble and she needs someone to save her, who does she turn to? Not them, me. Jeremiah says, and you help her despite all that she's done? And God, the husband, says, yes. Jeremiah says, why? Israel wants to know the answer as well. Yes, why? And God says, isn't it obvious? Because I love her. Crying and in a whisper, because I love her. Jeremiah says, are you able to get beyond the infidelities? And God, the husband, says to his wife, if you return, O Israel, if you return to me. So again, here we have the exact words of Jeremiah. In the end of the Haftorah, Im tashuv Yisrael nu Adonai, Elai tashuv. If you return, O Israel, declares the Lord, if you return to me, if you remove your abominations from my presence and do not waver, the abominations meaning the idols, the other gods that you've taken up and worshiped. And if you swear, as the Lord lives, in sincerity, justice, and righteousness, nations shall bless themselves by you and praise themselves by you. So at the end of this harsh Haftorah, in which God, is accusing his wife, his people, Israel, of infidelity, at the very end, he says, I'm willing to take you back. I'm willing to give you another chance. So that's this week's Haftorah, and we're left with Jeremiah bringing this message. And imagine the prophet coming and telling this story about an unfaithful wife and husband. People could relate to this soap opera. They understood it. Sometimes they didn't understand God and people, but they understood husband and wife. And here the prophet tells them the story. But soon it becomes clear that it's not about a husband and his unfaithful wife. It's about your husband and you are the unfaithful whore. And he uses these harsh words. So can you imagine the people's response, the people's reaction when this interesting soap opera all of a sudden gets turned on them? You're the villainess in this story. You're the whore, right? And you can imagine that maybe some people took this to heart, were devastated. Oh my God, I didn't realize. What have we done to God? Can he ever forgive us? I swear I'm never going to do this again. But it's more likely that the majority of people said, watch your language. Who do you think you're talking to? How dare you? And either walking away angry or going up to the prophet and spitting at him, punching him in the face, right? Kicking him when he's down. That's exactly what we read about last week when Jeremiah was chosen by God to bring this message. And God said, I will be behind you. I've got your back. But it was still tremendous amount of abuse that he had to go through. So we read the tragic story of Jeremiah and this very difficult mission that God sends him on. And once again, my point with all of the Haftorahs is that if you read these simply as very Shakespearean kind of speeches, they don't mean much to us. We don't get it. But if you see this as street theater, as Jeremiah gathering a crowd and playing out a therapist with his this couple, and the people are following the story and are fascinated until it becomes clear it's about them. We'll continue at 8:30 with Mara.